Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is John Meyer. John, great to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And so obviously we're here today to talk about cybersecurity, the cybersecurity of national security networks. There's a lot of cyber threats. They're constantly evolving. But based on your experience in the field, what do you think some of the most pressing cybersecurity threats facing defense and intelligence agencies are today that maybe they're not thinking about as much?
Well, I actually think there are less threats than they are challenges, right? Because on an everyday basis, we have evolving threats, whether it's bad nation-state actors, whether it's insider threats, whether it's new malicious malware or something else coming at us from different directions. I think the biggest challenge that government agencies have is staying up to date with what they're currently doing as they're planning to transition to the future.
Yeah, I mean, it's a constantly evolving IT infrastructure that they're dealing with, new threats that are kind of cropping up every week, every day even. I'm wondering, for defense and intelligence agencies specifically, they've been tasked with this National Security Memorandum 8 on improving cybersecurity across their networks, kind of raising the bar. That's from the White House. What do you think some overall strategies are for those agencies to achieve all the requirements that are outlined in that memorandum?
Sure. So it goes back actually one step past that to Executive Order 14028, which started with in May of 2021, asking all agencies to create a baseline, bring all their cyber infrastructure up to par at what they deem as the baseline level. And put those plans in place and then begin implementing it. And of course, when NSM-8 came out, and is very much focused at the intel community, what they call the national security systems, right? So those are systems that they deem the information on them is even more important. And coming out of that, what you see is the next level of planning for things like zero trust, for capabilities, defense in depth, layered cyber architectures. And then the implementation of it's called raise the bar, but it's a specification that comes from the agency, which dictates what they can and can't do with regards to movement between their networks, whether they're in the cloud or whether they're still on-prem. And I think the other piece that's important to note is that the journey to the cloud, it's exactly that. It's a journey, right? So as they're planning and designing their zero trust architectures, they're also leaning forward and saying, do we do this in the cloud? Do we still stay on-prem? Maybe we push most of this to the cloud. So it's a journey, and especially for those organizations, just keeping up to date, right? I mean, last week we had July 10th or 11th, Microsoft came out, the NATO summit over in Lithuania, and said, hey, there's a Word doc, and it has a vulnerability in it, right? It can take over your systems. Those are going to evolve. They're going to continue to happen. So staying on their guard for what they currently have to do while they're migrating to their future position, right, is really important.
Yeah, and you mentioned the extra considerations that national security agencies have in terms of passing data between different networks that are often at different classification levels, classified, unclassified. What are some particularly important considerations for those agencies when they're thinking about moving data across those different levels of networks?
Yeah, so NSM-8 and the requirement for raise the bar within NSM-8 spells out basically that you have to have certain types of technologies in place. And one of the things that came out at the most recent conference that the agency sponsors once a year, it's called CDTF, or the Cross Domain Technical Forum, was the fact that every zero trust architecture that's operated in the classified space, it's going to have cross-domain services, right? So just because you have zero trust doesn't mean that your transfers are not going to require a cross-domain service. And so for us, what we see is innovation around those cross-domain services, because the flow of traffic, like in any company or agency, is just continuing to grow, right? So how do they do this more quickly and with less incidents at their boundaries?
Quickly explain what a cross-domain service is for someone who might not.
Yeah, so it's like a bridge. It's like a toll gate bridge, right? So you have an island, which is a network that is isolated outside of this cross-domain service that sits at the boundary, and it allows the traffic to flow in and the traffic to flow out, And what they're most concerned about is exfiltration of data on the outbound movement through that cross-domain service, across that bridge to the next network, right? And they're concerned about infiltration or anti-malware, anti-ransomware on the inbound side of that, right? Because certainly, agencies do have breaches now and then. When they happen, it's how quickly you contain them. On a classified network, they just have to be able to lock down that drawbridge, shut it, and break the connection so that nothing bad happens.
Is that like a firewall as people traditionally think of it? Or
it's very similar to a firewall,
okay.
Except it's not externally available, right? It's only inside their networks between their broken connections or their isolated networks that they keep for depending on what level of classification it is.
Got it. And so, obviously they need to make sure that they can break those connections when necessary and ensure that they're, watching that traffic as it goes across the drawbridge. That leads to, questions about whether that's going to slow them down as they're trying to, share data more quickly, take advantage of AI, automation. What are some important considerations there?
So exactly that, right? It's that you have all this data coming through wanting to go out, you have all this data wanting to come in, and you only have so many cross-domain services, right? And the more data traffic they have, the more throughput they need. So technically, the more cross-domain services they may need to implement. And one of the things we've seen agencies looking at is what's called pre-filtering. Right, so a cross-domain service in and of itself basically filters the traffic to look for certain things. If it's outbound, it's looking for data that might be purposefully being exfiltrated by someone inside the organization. If it's inbound, it's looking at documents to basically strip out any malware or ransomware. And an important part is, like today, you get an email and it has ransomware in it. Maybe it's quarantined, right? With the technology that's being implemented in these cross-domain services, they have the capacity to cleanse the document. And what that means is it doesn't stop. It doesn't sit in a quarantine. And these are all based on the agency's guides. They invest a lot of money, research, looking at how you can cleanse a document once it's actually been infected by malware or ransomware, and then allow it to continue its journey so the business process doesn't break.
Wow, that seems like a really difficult nut to crack. Is the technology there to do that at scale at this point, or?
It is. It's called filtering, and the filters, the way the agency specs it out, is you have to filter 3 times. And 3, why do you have to filter 3 times? Why not 4? Why not 2? Right? Because what they found is in combination, every vendor that produces a filter, they do it just a little bit different, and so they test them in different configurations to figure out, hey, okay, now what does this look like? If you do filter 1, filter 2, filter 3, is that 99.99999, level of cyber assurance that nothing's going to get in? And what they found is in different combinations, you get different result sets, right? And with those different results, you get better results. So they found that filtering 3 times, and that's the requirement in the raise the bar specification from the agency, filter 3 times. So you take the filter processes it. Many times it's filtered for different characteristics each time it's filtered. So basically, by the time it gets in, it's like a newborn baby, right? So on the other side, it's perfect, pristine, clean. There's nothing you can do, except now you can go on with your process. Whereas in the commercial space, they don't typically filter like that, so it just gets quarantined. Then the business process breaks. Whether it's email or an FTP or a web download, it can't complete, right? So it's really important. Speed's definitely important because every guard or CDS that you have along that boundary, if it gets plugged up, it slows down the business.
Sure. You mentioned the 3 filter pass requirement. Is there anything else that you think is particularly important to note about what these agencies are looking for out of these types of capabilities going forward?
Well, it's interesting, especially in the classified space, because they don't communicate what's going on. Now, in RTB, the current spec, there's always been the capacity to do that, but it's just with NSM 8, organizations are now being told they have to be more open, right? And so they're beginning to share their data so someone can see, oh look, agency A over here and agency B over here, they're seeing the same types of attacks, right? We need to understand what's going on there.
Yeah, I think the National Security Memorandum really put the NSA elevated their role as the national manager
Yes.
across those agencies. There already were that, but I think it kind of bolstered their role there. When you think about what you can share from that forum that you attended and what the NSA is kind of seeing across the board, what are some of the things that they're looking for going forward across the board?
So first one is being able to move into the cloud.
Yeah.
Right. So they definitely want organizations to consider that. And as they do that, it's a challenge because the environments that they've been used to being in, right, they're now owned by pretty much 4 providers or maybe 5. IBM, Oracle, AWS, Microsoft / Azure, Google. Right. So then within those environments, how do they replicate what they already have with the cross-domain services, with filtering, with all these different capabilities? Today, most agencies, when they implement their cross-domain service, they're separated apart, right? In that no one knows what policy they're implementing. They don't know what data one agency is looking for versus another agency, right? Because they all take different approaches to that. So it's a challenge, and especially then moving that into the cloud, because the cloud, you think about it, you can just push everything in, infrastructure as a service, right? But they'd like to move it where it's actually a service or servitized, right? Where when someone wants to do a cross-domain transfer, there's a cross-domain service that scales up and scales down, and you can pass your data to it, and it'll move where it needs to move. But all that's in the works. Right? It's just being worked through now.
We were starting to talk about cloud computing and how it's kind of early days for defense and intelligence agencies as they move some of their systems into those environments. But how are you seeing perhaps the cybersecurity approaches change, the approaches to some of the issues we've been talking about with filtering traffic between networks and how they take on cybersecurity threats?
Sure. So as they move into the cloud, again, we had talked about the drawbridge, right? So you have these island networks, and they have to be able to communicate going back and forth, whether that's data coming in or data going out. The same types of events will need to occur in the cloud. The difference is that in the cloud, given its scalability, its built-in security elements, organizations would rather, instead of having these cross-domain services at those points, be able to kind of what we call filtering real time, which is look at the traffic or look at we call them complex document types that are moving within the environment and be able to call a service. Today, that isn't the way it works. Your documents circulate around inside the closed network, and then when they're ready to move out, they get sent to the edge, right? And it gets to the drawbridge and moves or doesn't. And if it doesn't move, by the way, that's a security incident, right? So if there's a finding, it gets stopped. So this notion of pre-filtering or real-time vetting of documents in the traffic is something that'll be much more capable to do in the cloud, the agencies will be. So I'm sure they'll be looking more at that, more intently at that, and how to gain efficiency. Because again, under NSM 8, any agency that has classified networks and moves into the cloud, they still have to use a cross-domain service. Whether it's a virtual service in Amazon or Azure or something else, or whether it's literally, like today, a physical piece of hardware with software embedded into it, right, that is that bridge gateway to go back and forth, then it will be the same thing in the cloud, just in a different manner. So looking at the traffic, I think, and understanding, and that actually walks right into zero trust, right? And organizations not only looking to move to the cloud, but to figure out how do you do that in the context of zero trust.
Yeah, talk about that a little bit more. Zero trust architecture is kind of that North Star where all agencies are going, including the national security community. How does this approach factor into a broader zero trust architecture?
Sure. So when you look at zero trust, I think a lot of people think it's, well, I go buy a product, I go implement it, I get zero trust. And that's not the case. Zero trust and what the reference model 800.207, which is NIST's publication on zero trust, and then their most recent publication, which has the update to that, which has the ZTA or Zero Trust Architecture Reference Model, specifically Draft 2. It talks about the different components you need to have internally. One piece that they don't talk about is that gateway. How do the files get in, and what do you need to do before they get there, right? Because the notion is once it's inside the architecture, it should be pretty safe. Truth be known, they probably will be a much higher a safety percentage than they are today in terms of malware getting in or ransomware getting in or someone being inside and exfilling data because of the way rights protections are done and access is granted inside of that network. But it's going to require lots of different products coming together and glued together under the zero trust architecture to make that work. Again, the key piece is filtering still going to exist in there, right? How often do you sample? What documents do you look at? How do you determine that? Those are all going to be important, I think, questions that agencies need to determine, how do they want to do that?
Yeah, I think I've heard people at conferences talk about how, zero trust isn't a move away from defense in depth and that
It's
kind
not.
of circle. It's
Absolutely.
just making the circle a little much tighter.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah, yes, yeah. Almost putting a set of handcuffs around the circle to make sure that, really, they use digital rights management, which you think once something's, digitally encoded and it's encrypted at rest and all the other good things that go with that, that it can't be penetrated. But, hackers are hackers and they're very innovative in their approaches.
Absolutely. I mean, are you seeing any specific threats today when it comes to some of these filters that you're running and how you're trying to keep up with some of those evolving threats? You talked about the NATO document. I think we've seen cloud services breached recently. I mean, there's just so much evolving in this space. What are you seeing?
So interestingly enough, what is today seems to remain the same today, right? The breaches are predominantly either link-based, which means it's coming in through an email message, so filtering on the email side, or it's document-based. So I think the last number I heard was 92 to 94% of the potential breaches that could occur are occurring through links in emails or attachments in documents. Wow. Right, which is significant because you think about how do we do our business today? Like tons of stuff comes in and out via email, right? Or you're out on the web and you're reaching for something to bring it in. It's all document based or what we call rich content based files.
Or Slack or other collaboration services that are always.
It can be in development environment. It can be anywhere.
Sure. And then in terms of future threats, something that has been a focus for agencies for the past couple of years in particular is quantum computing and quantum encryption. There's NSM-10 kind of directing agencies to start to address those threats. How are you seeing these requirements evolve in the national security space specifically and how they filter down into what agencies are having to do today on the cybersecurity front?
Yeah, so NSM-10 again is another very important one because data at rest, right? If quantum computing can break the encryption that we have today, well, then data at rest doesn't do us very much good, right? So we have to be leaders in that aspect of quantum computing so that we can actually be leaders in the aspect of anti-quantum computing encryption, right? That is breaking the encryption or making the encryption unbreakable, right, by quantum computing. And the agencies are all over it, right? They're trying to figure out what is their path. Most of them, though, today, they're like with Zero Trust, they're on a 2 to 5 year journey, right? They're planning out, they're figuring out what they need to do. Again, I just want to highlight, I think the most important thing for agencies to do is to continue to innovate with what they're doing today while they're building that out, right? While they're figuring out how they transfer, while they're moving into their zero trust architecture and creating their new anti-quantum computing encryption.
I think I saw NIST just release some new algorithms that can potentially defend against that type of quantum decryption. How early on are agencies though in kind of assessing, okay, I can bring this algorithm into my environment, I can apply this to my environment, doing the innovation today with what they're doing as you talked about?
So from our interactions with our customer base, the DoD and the intel agencies and all the other agencies, they've all laid out roadmaps. Yeah. And actually part of parcel of that is the fact that they've done it in that fashion specifically because 14028 executive order came out, and then with NSM-8 on top of that, it's been the forcing function, right? And you mentioned the national manager earlier, at the agency, right? The fact that the national manager was there before, but they couldn't, they generally could enforce it, but weren't really have all the buy-in, right? So now they do. I think the best way to view that is, the national manager has the capacity to go to any agency head and say, no, you have to do this, right? Now there are exemptions in there. Certainly there's the capacity to have exemptions, but all in, I think most agencies are like, we need to get on this. It's really important to us. We're going to lay out our roadmap and make it happen.
Yeah. On that national manager front, it almost seems like NSM 8 was putting the NSA in the same kind of seat that CISA is on the civilian side of government, where you now have these two entities making sure the entire federal government is kind of in lockstep on a lot of these requirements.
Yeah, very much so. And we advocate that. Look, if you were to buy a car and it had basic features on it, or you could buy a more expensive car that had even nicer features on it, right? If you could take some of those nicer features and put them into your the less capable car, why wouldn't you do that? So we advocate for organizations to look at what agencies like the NSA or other intel agencies, look at what they're doing with their technology and bring that to the civilian side. Why wouldn't you want to do that? Right? We wholeheartedly believe that data, it doesn't matter how the government defines it, all data is important, right? And you need to protect it at every stage.
Sure. Yeah, and I think we're starting to see some of that collaboration, but it's pretty early days. Well, John, in the minute or so we have left, are there any important thoughts that you'd like to leave us on here?
Again, primarily focus on innovating with what you have as you're going through that journey, right? Add more filtering, look at other techniques to protect yourself, because if the breach happens today, right, it may keep you from getting to tomorrow, right? So it's really important for agencies and companies alike, right, not to lose that focus.
Got it. All right. Again, I'd like to thank today's guest, John Meyer. John, thanks for a great discussion today.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Absolutely. Again, I'm your moderator, Justin Doubleday, and you're listening to Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Arcfield.